to me, 'cause I see the end. We try to be careful, please just be you. Always truth throughout, I wanna see the real you. I wanna love something real. Feel understand and know that we can feel. Someone that's real, someone that's true, someone that's me, someone that's you, someone that's love, someone that's smile, someone whose love stretches out for miles and miles and miles and miles. I'm gonna set you on, best believe I can. I'm gonna find you, I'll make you my man.
Hello and welcome back to the final Blue Talk of today, and the final Blue Talk actually of this year's North Shipping. And this is a topic I've been wanting to have a discussion about with people for a long time. It's been a topic that's been referenced, as I said, a few times before. We're going to be looking at the future of carbon capture and how it actually applies to the shipping industry. Because there's been a lot of talk about how carbon capture is part of the global CO2 picture, but there's also that discussion about how carbon capture fits into the shipping's own emissions, whether it can be used on board. It's a very sort of broad topic to get into in a way, but there is one project here, it's called LINCCS, and we're going to be using that as a reference to sort of get this picture kind of fully understood. So to get this on the way, I'm going to invite Craig Harvey. It's not often you get two Craigs on one stage. Craig Harvey is from Aker Solutions, so I'm going to leave it to you, Craig, to just outline what LINCCS is and how you see carbon capture fitting into the shipping industry.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Craig. So as you said, it's a very broad scope, so I think a little bit of reflection is a nice place to start. So for decades, Norway and the Norwegian industry has led the way in developing and demonstrating the importance of carbon capture and storage. We are, many of you here, CCS pioneers. And we're demonstrating this again on the work we're doing on Northern Lights and Longship. Here at North Shipping, it's been really inspiring, as you say, to hear ship-based carbon capture mentioned. It's on the agenda. Innovative solutions are emerging and the challenges associated with them are being recognized. This is very, very positive. Nevertheless, everyone that read the latest reports on Monday see that the trajectory is dire. The situation is clear, we're not moving fast enough. And with that window of opportunity that's closing, the call to action is pretty clear. Think bigger, move faster, and move now. And this is where LINCCS was born. LINCCS is a green platform financed industrial collaboration project, and it involves many of the Norwegian CCS pioneers. We're working together to connect and optimize the carbon value chain, which will enable us to deploy CCS faster and more cost-effectively at scale. The project hopes to be a major catalyst for positive change. We're collaborating across industries and across value chains on 5 key themes. In the offshore space, we're attempting to drive down cost by removing the complexity of making low-manned and unmanned, hopefully unmanned, offshore carbon capture possible at scale on FPSOs and offshore facilities. In the maritime and shipping space, we've seen initiatives struggle due to lack of clarity relating to what you do with the CO2 after you've captured it. Here, LINCCS will balance the equation by making ship-based capture possible at scale. We'll bring new capture solutions to the market. We'll establish a test bed for promising marine CCS technology, a maritime monster. We'll develop a digital ecosystem to help ship owners, ports, CO2 transporters to navigate the complex logistics of the emerging CO2 value chain. And we'll prove that it will be possible to offload ship-captured CO2 to permanent storage. We'll work to decloak the transition pathway for infrastructure on the NCS. We're creating a data-driven connection between one, the solution that the infrastructure represents, and two, the challenges which we can solve with that infrastructure. We hope to accelerate the decision-making process in the energy transition. Access to permanent storage is a key to sustainable CCS. LINCCS will drive down the cost by developing innovative, low-cost systems for permanent offshore storage of CO2 at the 100 megaton per year scale. The necessary systems and standard frameworks will be optimized to further maximize the development and utilization of the CO2 value chain in Norway. Longer term, the partnership will leverage Norwegian knowledge within the marine and ocean economies. We'll establish a leading research-based forum for the development of nature-based tools and methods to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and inject it into the CO2 value chain. This will further extend the impact of the CO2 value chain in Norway with the potential for export and the opportunity to create a climate-positive Norwegian continental shelf for tomorrow's pioneers. So, back to you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Now, before I just bring in the other panels here, because you're all part of the same project, and here, I think when we get to the other panelists, it'll be good to see, because this sort of explains the complexity of what you're talking about here, and sort of who's in the projects. But from Aker Solutions' point of view, this is, I mean, it's from an Aker point of view, in some respect, this is a part of a transition for the company. How do you see? I mean, when I looked at the International Energy Agency, they're very bullish about carbon capture, the need for carbon capture as a way to do the accounting of what is in the atmosphere. But there's been a lot of discussion about how slow it is for this to evolve. There's been carbon capture plants around the world for a number of years. It hasn't really grown the amount of carbon that's being captured, has it? And I'm guessing your project is here to sort of speed that up. It's about speed. It's about speeding up that transition. So from an Aker Solutions perspective, how confident are you that you can be able to sort of speed up that transition? It'll be part of what Aker Solutions is involved in. So I know there's the Longship project and the Northern Lights. I'm going to have to get you to explain the difference between those two. I kind of half know it and I can't remember, but is it really going to work?
Yeah, I think both Northern Lights and Longship are two major stepping stones in proving that it will work. Now they're in engineering, they're in development, they'll reach operations in the near future, and I think that will be a major sort of validation of the demonstration of it at scale. When we look at how Aker Solutions views this journey as a company, we definitely see that there's significant room to transition both our technology and our skill set from oil and gas into this new space. The challenges that we see, the technical challenges, the project challenges, they're solvable. What's typically a challenge now, as you say, is to do it quick enough, to do it at large enough scale, and to do that we need to get both volume across the value chain and to drive down costs to make the value chain, the chicken and egg grow at the same time.
Yeah, how many times have we heard chicken and egg over the last 2 or 3 days? In terms of what you can store with the molecule, and in what you can actually sort of achieve with it, do you see most of it being used in storage, or do you see an increased reuse?
I think the utilization element of the value chain, and I've seen it on numerous stages here around sort of alternative fuels, power-to-X based conversions. I think that plays a potential role in the transition, maybe not in the net zero sort of major role in that space. But when you are establishing these clusters in the CO2 value chain, the ability to create local circular economies around CO2 utilization, CO2 as a valuable molecule, I think then that's the sites and the opportunities we'll see arising.
Can I ask the other panelists just to come up now, please? Because I want to broaden the conversation again and just and we'll look at the various aspects of this LINCCS project from their perspective. And I'm going to start with Ola from Equinor, if I could, because you're the clearly everybody understands the sort of background of Equinor and what it is. But can you explain to us why Equinor sees something like this as a key stepping stone for Equinor?
Yeah, definitely. Let's start with the beginning, I think, because CCS is a suite of tools to kind of capture CO2 from diverse sources, then transport it and sequester it or utilize it. And there's no doubt that the technology works. It's proven. We've done it for more than 25 years ourselves, and others have been doing it for longer. And there are obviously other challenges at play, and we'll probably come back to them. But I think that Craig points to something that's very important, and that's the Northern Lights project. And that's been an innovation in the sense that all previous projects have been sourced to sink. So all CCS projects have been sourced to sink, so that one single project has had to accommodate the whole value chain from capture to storage. What we now see with Northern Lights is the open transport and storage hub type of value chain, which opens up a completely new ball game. And we see that this is kind of helping catapult CCS back up again on the agenda. And I think that what we see is that CO2 capture technology and how that, or the discussions around that have changed quite a bit the last 10, 15 years. If you go back 10, 15 years ago, it was mostly about power generation with CCS. Now we see that CO2 capture is evaluated from lots of different sources. And that is enabled by this open transport and storage project or approach. Because what we need is we need scale in the transport and storage domain to get the costs down. And then, all the different providers of CO2, let's say, they can get a cheap tariff for their transport and storage, fees. And for Equinor, we've been performing R&D on CCS for decades, and it's been going through lots of ups and downs. Luckily, lately, it's on its way back up again. You said the EA is very bullish. I think most reputable institutes or academics are bullish on CCS and the importance of CCS. And I think that what we see now is that things are starting to move. Yesterday, it was announced that the second and the third license for CO2 storage on the NCS. And I think this is definitely showing that we and others are moving ahead to provide storage services to interested parties. And then I think that's the first step in stopping the blame game. Because now all the emitters can't say that, but there's not enough storage volume, or there are nobody providing storage volumes to us anymore. And we can't say that, but nobody wants to provide the CO2 anymore. Yeah. Now we actually see that we're starting to move. And the LINCCS project is very important in this aspect because it brings together, very important companies across the value chain. And we're trying to look at the value chain in an integrated manner.
So this is very much storage as a service. Yeah. So you provide the storage service, and there's the transport chain that builds around it. So emitters can actually say, okay, Equinor, we need somewhere by our requirements. We've got to store this. We're going to pay you to store it in one of those depleted resources in the North Sea, for example. Yeah. And through what you develop, you're able to go and put it in there. And I see the same happening in Scotland as well. I know there's a lot of projects around there. Whereas previously, with the sort of existing systems, it was kind of one entity trying to do all of it in one go. So that's why are you saying that is why the costs were high initially, because it was kind of a whole chain approach by kind of one or two entities that were able to do that. You're trying to get economies of scale.
Yeah. Definitely in the transport and storage domain, scale is key. So you definitely need to get the scale up to get the costs down.
Okay. So I mean, let me go to Francesco, because from Syntef, you do this research, and no doubt you've been looking at this. So first of all, explain why Syntef is on this project, because people want to know sort of what's the sort of research angle you have when it's a very sort of business orientated thing. So, and then we'll look at sort of how you can look at that in scale and the harmony.
Yeah, very good. That's an excellent question. I mean, what Syntef has to do, if you look at the complexity of the project, how many partners that are usually sort of companies that are one-to-one, they come together. Maybe it says a bit about how Syntef operates. So behind the history of this project, there is a couple of centers which Syntef leads, is the NCCS Research Center and the Low Emission Research Center. There are two centers where they bring together lots of partners that come with several ambitions. One of the ambitions is to actually make CCS possible. So I think it's great. They are a platform for cooperation, these centers. They are mostly non-commercial, but they do develop some spin-offs like LINCCS, which are commercial solutions. So we are super happy to be in a way to have provided this platform to come and bring together companies like Wärtsilä, Aker, Equinor, Total Energies, plenty of companies, plenty of big actors with the same interest, and in this case is to bring to commercialization CCS. So that's Syntef's role behind. We do also a lot of research, aside from running platforms. That's we can get back to that.
Do you see the amount of CO2 that can be captured as being significant? I know the IEA is quite bullish in terms of what could be done with it, but do you think that it is going to be realistically achieved, and how do you look at the time spans that we're...
If you think about the full deployment of carbon capture, you're looking at the billion tons of CO2 per year. It's a significant scale. I believe projects like this can be sort of a springboard for success.
Yeah. Because the track record isn't very good.
No, not so far. But we have been researching for like 20 years, and this is, I feel, the moment where actually companies like Equinor and Aker come to the table, come with their resources, and really come into play. So that's, I feel it's really exciting. It's sort of, in a way, it's a very progressive moment where we see that this is actually happening. So I can leave the word to Wärtsilä, to Equinor. They're really excited to be here. So it's
but in terms of that, I'm going to come to Sigurd in a moment, because I'm going to talk to you mostly about the shipboard capture, because you and I have talked a lot about that. But Willie, in terms of the shipping entity here, we're going to need CO2 carriers here. We're going to need that transport chain that he's talking about. First of all, what do you do in the chain? I think we need to get that story out as well. But I want to talk about, again, going back to that locking in that chain and where the various services are. Who's going to become the CO2 carriers? Are there enough CO2 carriers for this? Because the only ones I know take CO2 to make Coca-Cola and things like that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the whole supply chain, needs to be developed. We are a catapult center, and our role is, of course, to make facilities available so that technology company can verify and qualify their technology. And of course, some of the big players here, they have some technology already in place, but to have the full value chain, you need all the different small companies connected to this, and that's where we in the Catapult Center will play a role. So we will, in LINCCS, we will invest in infrastructure so that the partners in LINCCS, but also other CCS technology developers can come to us and test their technology.
Sorry, let me just go back to Syntef just one second. Just something struck to mind there. How much of this CO2 is going to be pipeline, and how much is it going to be shipping?
You're thinking about in LINCCS, or you're thinking about in the...
Globally, whole thing.
Globally?
I mean, if we're going to achieve that IEA objective, how much... I'm just trying to get a picture. Maybe some of the other ones. Where does shipping fit into this transportation picture? Or is it going to be local storage with pipeline?
Well, let's say 5% of the global CO2 emissions more or less come from shipping.
No, not from shipping, not from shipping. I mean, if we're going to take CO2 that's emitted from a power station, a steel mill, or anything like that, and it's going to be shipped from somewhere to be stored somewhere, or pipeline from somewhere to be put in underground because we're going to store it, how much of that market of captured and
It's gonna be
stored CO2 from everywhere, not shipping, just everywhere, how much of that is going to be sent via a ship and how much of it is going to be through a pipeline?
It's really hard to say at this moment in the sense. It depends on how we develop the actually, this is part in a way of the maybe a response that we'll find out during LINCCS, because it depends really much on how we develop the chain. We try to pipeline most of what we can because pipeline is generally cheaper for larger amounts, but shipping will be substantial for sort of smaller point sources that then can collect.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a really good point, because one of the challenges we're trying to address in LINCCS is what do we do with these distributed emitters that aren't in a cluster, that don't have shore-based consolidated temporary storage, that don't have a pipeline out to offshore storage. How do you decarbonize those emitters? And I think that's a challenge we're trying to address. Exactly what the solution will be.
Some of these emitters may not have large volumes. You know, there's relatively small emitters, probably is the best way of putting it. I mean, there's large volumes for some aspects, but it's being able to have that, not distribution, but the reverse of collection model, so that you can actually have it going into the places where it's going to be stored.
Definitely. The value chain has to be connected. It has to also be able to connect to these smaller emitters and the distributed emitters at a sustainable cost level.
And clearly, if you're having a ship part of that chain, you want that ship to be clean as well. Sigurd, let's talk about carbon capture on board the ship.
Yep.
Because you and I have spoken over the years about using exhaust gas cleaning systems, and I recently interviewed you specifically about how you were developing kind of multi-use, multifunction systems now. So obviously you're looking at the ability to use the same kind of technology to actually go and capture the CO2 coming out of the funnel of the ship. So this isn't necessarily the transportation of the ship, but every kind of ship as well. So there's two questions here. One of them actually, and maybe one of the others maybe, how do you capture CO2 when it's being emitted? So I know there's different processes. Which one is best suited for capturing ship emissions? And what do you plan to do with it? Because you've got to store it on the ship, and then you alluded to the needs to have a chain to get it off the ship and do something with it if you've got small, particularly, because this is going to be relatively small volumes, isn't it, compared to a power station or something like that. So first question, what's the technology? Second, how do you see it working? And I'll put a third question in there. What's the percentage of CO2 you can collect?
And I'll answer the previous question first.
Okay.
You keep track of the questions.
Yeah.
I think what you were trying to say is that CO2 storage presents a fantastic opportunity for shipping as an industry, because there's going to be a huge demand for CO2 carriers.
Yeah.
I think you'll see a mix of pipelines where that is applicable. Say North America may be more suited for that. Here in Northern Europe, I mean, most of our reservoirs are offshore. That we don't have the pipelines that can carry CO2, so you need ships. So, I mean, for a setting like this, yes, there's a lot of ship owners who should be looking and are looking very closely at CO2 carriers. So I think that has sort of an added dimension to the whole thing. When it comes to the capture technologies, we spent a lot of time and years looking at different solutions, and we see that on land, solvent-based scrubbing solutions they're what's most mature. You have those in different sizes and really industrial scale operating. It takes a bit of tweaking and research, and it doesn't come sort of without its challenges to shrink that, say, 34-meter high tower down to something that you can actually put on a ship, and which can stand the motions and the dynamics on a ship. But I'd say we have a fair bit of competence on putting scrubbers on ships when it comes to sulfur scrubbers. And we see that when we take that technology, apply it to the solvent-based scrubbing for CO2, yes, it works. And we're running tests at the moment. And I think your third question was the capture rate.
Yeah, I mean, how much can you capture?
At the moment, we're somewhere between 65 and 70.
Yeah.
I initially set the target at 70, but I realized that was not ambitious enough. So we need to raise the target a little bit. But we can capture, maybe not 100%, but for sure. A 75% reduction is quite a lot better than what it is today.
Yeah, go on, Craig.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce the importance of that back to what I stated about the urgency of acting now with the technology we have available now. If you can capture 75%, capture 75%, and then here we're working to ensure that if you do capture 75%, there is a value chain that you'll be able to offload it to and store it and gain your, in Europe at least, your carbon credits associated with it.
Yeah. And one of the, what we see that is every industry claims that it's very difficult to decarbonize. Everyone says that. And for shipping, it's really true. But, or at least we claim so, it is more difficult for shipping. You have multiple mobile sources. Yes, that has some challenges. But carbon capture has or presents an opportunity to really get those significant reductions at a much faster pace than many of the other alternatives. They will come and find their place eventually, but 2 or 3 years we can start putting this on a lot of ships, and that is a lot of CO2 not being emitted. So I think, and we can use the existing infrastructure, but we need the added aspect of the storage and the transportation and all of this. So that is sort of or where we see that LINCCS really is going to help us. We build on what we have, and then we add to the when it comes to the infrastructure. So,
Ola.
I just want to build a little bit on what Craig said about the pace and the pace that is needed, because I think I said in the beginning that CCS is proven technology. Obviously, for different applications, you need to qualify it specifically for that use. But I think the point that Craig made about if you can capture 70% now, do it. I think that's very important, because we see lots of really interesting stuff happening with next generation CO2 capture, whether it's onshore, offshore, perhaps also for ships. And you can always lean back and say that, okay, this next generation will be better than what we have today. But the thing is that to actually, get the ball running properly, you need to industrialize it. You need to get to scale with the current technologies, and that's when you really see the ball rolling. And solar PVs are kind of the get-to argument that you use when you talk about that. But I think that we will experience similar things in all industries, and I think that for CO2 capture, CCS, start with what we have today, continue with research on the next generation in parallel, and then you'll see that we start to establish scale, the costs will go down, the next generation will be brought up because there's pull, and the ball will be rolling. And then we'll see which kind of industries will CO2 capture and CCS be relevant for. And it's been talked a lot about today as well, what is the future fuel for the maritime industry. But I think also when it comes to CCS, we don't exactly know which industries will be using CO2 capture and CCS in the future. But, building infrastructure and kind of getting it out there is the first step. And, we can do it now. And LINCCS is a very important platform in that aspect, because it's not yet another research project at the foundational level, but it's actually about bringing technologies that are close to market out to market. And that's exactly what we need at this point in time.
Francesco.
Yeah, I'm really happy you mentioned that. A couple of points, actually. I use a similar analogy, but about cars. If you think about how Tesla evolved, right? They started with a sport car that had a horrible räckvidde, sort of length of drive. Maybe you could drive 50 kilometers. And of course, you can come back and say, well, it was crap at the beginning, but after several years, now they are working with electric cars, and we know that electric car is going to be in the mainstream. So it's a bit about the same concept. When you evolve things, you start with batteries that were really not ready for car application. It's the same for CCS. You start with capture technology that might not be ready for shipping, but tomorrow the capture technology will get easily to 90% after we have some tweaking. So it's about getting the market going and coming up. So I'm really happy, and I agree. The second part is actually seen that we have researched many years on CCS, so we had several research centers, and I would say this is maybe the most concrete project out of it. So I'm super happy to see that evolution, and that evolution is taking place, and I'm really sure it's going to happen.
Yeah, just add on to that. I mean, as a catapult center as well, I mean, we will be always looking in the full chain here to find, is there something that isn't commercial enough, something that is too expensive? Can we go out to the industry and say, well, can someone fix this? This component is now made of gold, obviously not something that you can export. Can someone make this in plastic or in composite or something else, and it still works? So that would be one angle of how we would search for new technology here. The other way is, of course, that there is something in the technology that isn't good enough, something in the technology that can be done better. And of course, then we have our testing facilities together with Wärtsilä here, where companies can come and test their technology at a fairly low cost compared to if you would need to invest in this infrastructure yourself. Yep. So this is an open infrastructure, so everybody is welcome to come and test their technology, and maybe even that can be a spin into the LINCCS project in the end. So interesting. And also, some of these things that can be so difficult that even Francesco needs to worry about them.
When you're looking at actually, I'm going to just lean in on the technology a little bit. I'll come into the shipboard technology again in a minute, Sigurd, but I want to look at the technology of taking the CO2 off of the vessel ashore, and then what happens is so it can be injected into the storage location. So can you run me through how that works? So we've got the concept of, you've got the capture technology on the polluting unit, you capture it, reduce it down into probably a compressed gas or a liquefied gas, goes onto a vessel, transported as cargo, and then gets pumped ashore. But what then happens? Can you run me through that process of how it goes from discharging ashore to then to being injected into a reservoir? And that's to Craig, that. So I want you to go through that.
You want to answer, or do you want me to answer?
I think you start, and then I'll add on something at the end.
Well, I think the basis is that you need to...
From wake to well, right?
Yeah, exactly, from wake to well. You need to liquefy it. That's the only real option you have for handling it on board. Then you can store it in sort of bulk tanks or even ISO containers, depending a little bit on what sort of a vessel you have and the operations. But so the offloading as such would be a little bit different, but that isn't really known material. How do you offload and handle the CO2? And then part of the LINCCS project is really to look at how do we optimize that hub and spoke model? Where do you collect it? How do you intermediate storage? How do you deal with that? And then onwards transportation. The basic technologies for handling CO2, I think in that sense are known and are there, so that's not part of the development. It's more looking at where should the different bits and pieces of the puzzle be, and then once you have it stored, okay, then you ship it offshore, and that's when Craig does his magic.
But would it go from the storage ashore? Would it then go through a pipeline? Would it go?
I think one of the challenges we see, and one of the reasons we're addressing it at a value chain perspective, is depending on how you collect the CO2 and the volumes of the CO2 and the distance between that collection point and your final storage point. There's a number of different system methods that allow you to inject it and store it permanently. Each of them have different cost levels, so we're trying to identify and then de-risk the right storage mechanism for the right system setup. So for example, if we're collecting CO2 from the vessels en route in offshore hubs, can we inject them locally, or do we need to have shuttle collection consolidation vessels transporting it back to the shore-based hubs, which then transport it by pipeline? Or can we inject it in smaller volumes directly into the storage wells offshore, nearly in transit?
Okay.
So I think there's some of the really interesting concepts which we're evaluating here, which again, we want to drive down the cost of that mechanism from wake to permanent storage.
No, I just want to follow up a little bit on that, because when we describe the value chains, we make it sound so complex and challenging, But the thing is, if you think about how the fossil fuel value chain works, it's actually super complex as well. It's not like it's only one fossil fuel that goes around. There are lots of different grades and types that are used for different purposes. but it's just that we're used to it. That's just the way it is. And I think in the end, it's about reducing the costs. That will be the proof of in the pudding, in a sense. If we're able to reduce the costs, that's what we're aiming to do. But it might still be complicated. And I think that for certain applications, you'll see the simple one. Whether it's a cement plant with CO2 capture, or it's a steel, a hydrogen factory, blue hydrogen factory with CO2 capture, and a pipeline out to a storage facility. Some applications will be like that, but for many others, the value chain will be complex, and it will be a little bit more costly. But I think that, we will see that the costs go down there as well. And I think that even in the future, you will see that certain parts of the CCS value chain will be complex, just like existing value chains today are complex. But it's just that when it works, nobody talks about it.
Well, that's what you want, really. You want a system that nobody notices. It's a bit like the internet. When the internet was launched, everybody was talking about how the internet is the internet, and then everybody realized they could actually just look at pictures of cats on it. Don't question how they get that anymore. Francesca?
Yeah, just a very nice consideration based on what we just discussed. Actually, these 5 companies pretty much represent 5 different business models for CO2 capture, or for CCS. So you have products on that side, you have research of different scale, and you have someone that actually want to sell it as a service one day. So, and in addition to that, you could actually reduce your CO2 emission offshore by capturing the CO2 from the gas turbines. So it's like, if you look at how many business models you actually have in this pool of companies, it's really many. That's kind of interesting. It's not just, so looking at the value chain perspective means actually looking at each individual business model and analyzing the pros and cons and how the possible approaches could be with regards to the different geographical location where you actually want to deploy the model. So that's kind of very interesting. It's a part of the job in this project.
Yeah. How much capacity is there?
For storage?
Yes.
Enough.
We are in the billions.
So for the foreseeable future, there's enough storage volume. I think if you look at the IPCC's reports, or every academic study that's done with some level of credibility, there's enough storage volume in the world for the foreseeable future, even at large scale. The problem is that we don't have sedimentary basins everywhere, so sometimes you need to transport the CO2 to where it's going to be sequestered.
Yeah, I was also going to ask about the location of the sites that are suitable for storage, because obviously you're not going to have a handy storage where you see where the CO2 is produced, where the pollution is produced. It's not always going to be, like you said, you've got a capture, you've got a pipeline, you've got a storage. There will be that kind of a level of complexity towards that. So, I mean, where geographically are the known places? North Sea is obviously one of them. And are there sort of major points? Is it usually the empty reservoirs? So we could say Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, places like that?
Well, there are sedimentary basins, many places in the world. And yes, to a certain extent, they correlate with where you have had oil and gas production, have had oil and gas production. If you look at, for example, the Northern Lights project, we're actually storing in a saline aquifer. So it's not in a depleted oil and gas reservoir, but it's obviously in the same sedimentary basin as the oil and gas reservoirs have been. But you find these, in many parts of the world. But in some parts of the world, it's more challenging. Like in Japan, for example, they're not as spoiled as we are here offshore Norway. So in certain cases, you need to transport it further distances than what we see here. But onshore US has gigantic storage potential. The NCS or the North Sea in general, there are lots of other areas as well.
Yeah, and the reason you start with reservoirs just quickly is because you sort of know the reservoir configuration. You actually have a lot of knowledge about the reservoir, so that's why you use a reservoir. But you could use an aquifer, and there are plenty of aquifers pretty much everywhere in the world. You just don't have enough knowledge to be sure.
Maybe you should explain what an aquifer is.
Oh, yeah. So it's not aquifer is not an oil and gas reservoir. It's sort of in a way a formation which is behind a cap rock, which contains water. We can call it that way. A cap rock is a rock that covers the formation and prevents, in a way, the migration of CO2 towards the surface, which is what you don't want to have if you capture CO2 permanently.
It's a water well, yeah?
Yeah.
It's sort of a deep
it's a water balloon.
Deep water storage well.
Correct. It's a deep water balloon located down on Earth.
I want to talk a little bit about the port reception of captured CO2 on board a vessel. So if you've got a vessel and you install a CO2 capture system, a scrubber, onto the vessel, and you've got a tank there storing the captured CO2, cryogenically chilling it down so it's compressed or liquefied, you're going to have known places that can receive, a bit like we've got waste reception facilities on shipping. You're going to have to look at having port reception for captured CO2 to come off of ships. So obviously it's not going to be ships that are transporting CO2, it's going to be LNG carriers, every kind of ship that could have it. So how do you look at that when you're talking about the chain, how you take the CO2 off of a vessel that's captured it, how it's stored onto the ship, onto the port, and then how it fits into that value chain that Craig was talking about?
Yeah, we're going to need all of that value chain. That's one of the reasons why we are part of LINCCS. You need an offtake of the CO2. I think in the short term, sort of the first adopters would even be able to sell the CO2. There's a market for CO2 today.
Yeah.
And the CO2 purity that we get is quite high, so it can be utilized for different, or as a raw material for different purposes. But okay, once you get widespread adaptation, yes, I suspect supply of CO2 is going to far outstrip demand, and then sequestration or storage is obviously one of the, and that is an agreement that needs to be in place. And I know there are various initiatives also in Norway to look at developing reception terminals and seeing from various sources and then for onward processing. We also, in all of the discussions that we have had with both ship owners and others, we're starting to see a lot of interest also in the CCU, so the usage potential, synthetic fuels and so on. So that is also, and there's a lot of oil companies, Equinor is certainly there as well, but everyone is looking at using CO2 as a raw material. So I don't think we will be limited to just sequestration. It's going to be a mix of solutions. Yeah. But for sure, reception facilities, and you need to have somewhere to offload it. And Northern Lights is at least one initial that can be tapped into, and then we need to develop more, and that's what we're doing.
I'm going to Craig, you got something to add, but I got a question first, because Sigurd mentioned CO2 quality. What do you mean? What does it mean? CO2 is CO2.
Yeah, so CO2, when you capture it, you capture, yes, CO2, but you capture other elements in the mix. And I think, as Ole mentioned, there's different grades of CO2, different potential contaminants in the CO2, which may limit how you can potentially use it, or how compatible it is with the storage location. And I think when you look at again that value chain, finding harmonized states of CO2 that allow you to transfer them between the different systems is quite crucial. And then that's back to my comment about ports, harbors, offloading. How do you do that? And here, standardization becomes really key. So we're looking at, from a value chain perspective, how can we contribute to standardizing that value chain, finding these touch points which enable the value chain both to keep costs down, but grow at scale quickly.
What sort of concerns are there about non-standardization? Are you talking about different compressed or liquefied CO2, or?
Maybe I can ask Ole to say a few words about the Northern Lights standard, because for example, for Sigurd to give you CO2, has to check the box, right?
Yeah. So with the Northern Lights project, we have established a CO2 specification that basically says kind of which contaminants can you have with the CO2 and at which concentrations. We have also specified the pressure and temperature that the CO2 need to be delivered off at, and that is publicly available. You can find it online, or in obviously contacting us or the Northern Lights joint venture. But the challenge, and the Northern Lights is essentially the first one to see this challenge at scale, because previously, as I said, all projects were source to sink. Then you could calculate which contaminants came with your CO2 from the capture process, and you can accommodate for that throughout the value chain. Now we are in a completely different situation where the CO2 may come from ships, it might come from cement, from steel, from hydrogen production, and there are different contaminants. And trying to find the golden balance there, where you're not gold plating your entire transport and storage system, but you don't have to be so strict on the conditioning that the capture cost goes skyrocketing. That's a relatively new problem to be looked at because of this new situation.
What are the risks? What are the risks of contaminants in CO2? What are those risk points?
There are, you could have corrosion, for example, in your transport and storage facilities if you exceed the spec. That's one. Or the other way around, if you're too strict on your specifications, then it might become overly expensive to clean your CO2. Just so. So currently, we're taking a bit of a conservative approach, and then we're rather trying to open up because we really need to make sure that we do it right with the first projects. We don't want any incidents, but then with the experience and continued operations, with new customers or sources of CO2 coming in, we'll get more experience about what kind of pollutants do we see or contaminants do we see, and then we can try to cater for that. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's some fundamental contaminants which are a challenge, and that's of course water due to the combination of water and CO2, which creates a very corrosive.
What does it create? Like an acid?
Yeah. So that situation you definitely want to avoid. That's relatively fundamental across the value chain, irrespective of where you capture it from. But as mentioned, depending on where you capture it from, what type of engine, what type of fuel, what fuel mix, all of those elements result in other sort of variable contaminants, and those we always need to explore.
You and I spoke recently about the sort of future. I wrote this article about the future of scrubbing, and you've got that. I kind of found that sort of list of potential things that we can take out of the emissions, and it seems to be almost like to the point where you'd almost have just the water vapor going up. I mean, is it going to be feasible to have a multi-function scrubber? Because I think one of the things you said is you're still going to have the sulfur scrubber. If you're using hydrocarbon fuel and you're scrubbing that, you're still going to need a sulfur scrubber to be able to use the other kind of scrubbers.
Yeah, we've looked at a lot of different technologies for doing carbon capture. And I think common for all of them is that you need to pre-treat the exhaust before you do the capture, be it with membranes or with solvents or sorbents. So yes, you have to have some sort of a scrubber in front. Maybe if you run on a light fuel or gas, you don't need to remove the sulfur, but you still need to remove particulates, and you need to cool it down. And yes, that's where scrubbers, they serve multiple purposes in the pre-treatment of the exhaust before it goes into a carbon capture system. And yeah, we're playing around with ideas on how we could integrate all of it into one. Let's see which solution would be the more economical. Might be an interesting engineering task, but it still needs to be cost efficient as well. But the great advantage from a shipping perspective is that if you put a scrubber on board today, you are prepared to also add a carbon capture system once the incentives are there, because that is unfortunately the case, that everyone wants to reduce emissions, but no one is getting the cost of it.
And when they've got to pay for it themselves, basically, or
exactly.
somebody else to do that. But you've got to have the capacity on board to have the storage. Have you looked at different size vessels, different fuel consumption, and therefore different routes, the different size of storage tank you're going to need on different vessels?
Yeah, you will obviously have a storage requirement, or you'll need to store a lot of CO2. Every ton of fuel gives you 3 tons of CO2.
Yeah.
So, but still, compared to many other alternatives, the additional storage space is much less than, say, for hydrogen or ammonia. And the tanks you can fit, typically there will be space on a ship. The treatment equipment you almost always find space for on the aft deck. Tankage, there are other areas of the ship where you can put the tankage, but it does depend on the ship. If you're a tramper sailing from China to Brazil, that's a long voyage and a lot of CO2. So you'll need either to discharge along the way or have bigger tanks. If you're doing coastal, you can do it with 20-foot container units.
There was that project.
Or offload in the middle of the year.
There was that project to look at actually turning it into dry ice and dropping it.
There was that project, yes.
I don't know. I don't think anything was going to come of it. Oh, I wanted to look at now at the sort of commercial element here for this model of storage as a service, and sort of making it cost effective for those companies that want to then have Equinor or whoever actually take the CO2 off their hands, basically. How do you see the pricing kind of work here to make it? What are the incentives that needs to be in place for industrial businesses, big emitters, shore-based big emitters to actually see this as a value to them? What sort of policies do you see needing to come into place? What sort of support do they need to be able to see that and then start actually kind of signing up for Longship and such?
I think, as a company, we argue for a carbon tax. I think that's essentially what you need, and there needs to be a cost for emitting CO2, essentially. And then, in addition, in the market build phase, we need subsidies or some kind of support to get it going. We do obviously see that there's a green momentum going around. Some companies, individuals are willing to pay for greener stuff in general. But that is very, industry specific. And, if you look at direct air capture, for example, a lot of people seem to be willing to pay for that. But, not so many people are willing to pay to reduce the same amount of CO2 emissions from the ship fleet or elsewhere. Yeah. So I think that, CO2 emissions need to have a price. That's, basically our standpoint. And then we need subsidies to get going. But what we see is that, in transport and storage, especially offshore, when you get to scale, the costs are reduced very drastically. So that's one step. But then obviously technology is important as well. And, a lot of the work in the LINCCS project is trying to kind of to reduce the cost in the storage domain as well. And we do see that obviously, several of our companies are coming from the oil and gas industry. We're used to oil and gas standards. We're used to, gigantic income, good revenues and margins. This is completely different. It has a completely different risk profile. CO2 is not combustible. And it has different properties as a fluid. So you can do things differently. And I think that, leveraging our experience from the oil and gas side, together with some key vendors, both in the LINCCS project and in other R&D projects, in real development projects, we can leverage that experience together with our knowledge about CO2 as a fluid to get the costs rapidly down. So if you get better incentives to the emitters, and especially now in the market building phase, support that infrastructure building, then we'll see that the costs come down, and then technology will start to play an important role in breaking that curve even further down and making CO2 storage, I'm not sure if I would say affordable, but at least, at a completely different level of where it is today. So
yeah. I'm interested in sort of the time span as well here, because if you've got the right pricing model, because you're selling, as I say, you're selling a service. So are you going to, is it kind of like a rental agreement? Do you say, okay, I'm going to hire a storage to put my belongings in, so I'm going to hire a storage for 6 months, a year. If I'm an emitter, do I go to Equinor and say, I've got some CO2, can you store it for me, and you give me a rate per 1,000 years?
I don't know exactly how those contracts will be, but obviously there is regulators. You have there are laws and regulations governing CO2 storage. You have the EU storage directive. In Norway, we have regulations in most areas where you consider storing CO2. So and there are a number of ways of attacking this. Some some countries they bring in third parties. In Norway, you might not need that because we have a good system with the regulations that we have. But if there are emitters around that want to capture the CO2 and store it somewhere, I'd take contact with our business development teams.
Yeah, but that raises another question. You just brought another question into my head there, is who owns the CO2 then? Are they going to sell it to you? So the CO2 is your responsibility. So if it leaks, if it emits, if something happens, let's say there's an earthquake or something, and is it then your emissions, not their emissions? Where's the CO2 liability in this chain?
I'm not the legal expert, so I don't think I should be answering those. But there are, there are regulations and there are laws that govern this, and there are, there are unilateral agreements, and so I think that there are systems in place, but I can't point to the specifics.
Go on.
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, at least looking at the value chain and how you support that de-risking is ensuring that at each stage of your value chain, when the ownership or possession of the CO2 changes, that you're documenting it well, that you have systems that sort of self-document and facilitate that ownership transfer.
There has to be that liability. Understood. Same with on the shipping. If you've got a carbon capture system on a ship and you capture the carbon, it goes into storage on the ship, they go into port, it gets discharged into the port has got a larger storage facility, larger than the ship, because it has numbers of ships coming in. If there is an incident on that port, would the port be liable? Is it their CO2 now, or is it the ship's? Does the ship operator have to sell the CO2 to the port, or is it selling it to Equinor and it's going via the port? It doesn't have overall. Have you looked at that sort of liability chain yet?
I think that's going to vary a little bit case by case. Yeah. But to me, the logical solution is that whoever possesses the CO2 is also the one who's reliable for it, if you will. That at least would seem to make the accounting easier. I'm sure there are some lawyers and business development guys. I think you just gave Equinor an idea, renting out on a sort of maybe not 1,000 a year, but say every 5 years you need to renew the rental agreement.
Yeah, you can
nice steady cash flow.
There's a lot of demand for storage right now, so I know you've got 10,000 tons here. That's just how the rates have gone up a little bit. But I think it's a serious point to raise in terms of this whole chain that you're developing. I mean, when you're mentioning sort of CO2 as a storage, I'm thinking about software as a service. In that they develop software as a service, but then you've got to understand where the liability lies in sort of using a service. So if I'm using a storage service, am I covered under my own insurance? Is it your liability? Is it my liability? And the whole picture has to be really clear.
I think also it's worth a reflection back here to the EU regulations and the taxonomy about how you're connecting the credits up to permanent storage. So they're very directly connected from any CO2 emission. The quotas and the credits are connected to it being validated, permanently stored. So I think what we're, at least from our side, from our solution side, what we're seeing is that a lot of these cluster hubs and emitters that are developing CO2 value chains, they're needing to have end-to-end agreements in place. So if you are going to start capturing, definitely have a place to store it in mind.
Yeah, I can add that this is actually an issue that is looked at in LINCCS. So we have several PhDs in the University of Oslo that exactly think about how does the trading system work. So it's more like lawyers, but they will look at where is exactly a trading point, where the risk is passed to the customer, where the risk is passed to sort of the vendor in a way, of the supplier. It differs. Tendentially, you have sort of a transition system where you have to measure how much CO2 you sort of deliver, and you have to certify that. So this type of mechanism, it's actually used in the oil and gas. It's not so rare when you sell oil. Then you have a specific transition point where you say beyond this point. So it's not uncommon, I'd say. It will just work in reverse for CO2, because you're actually sending the CO2 to somebody and you're paying for that service. So you're literally paying somebody to take care of your CO2.
Yeah.
And I think, regardless of the transfer of liability, I can say that, all the emitters that come to us, they are adamant that the storage is permanent, regardless of whether the liability is transferred. because we're not doing this for fun. It's actually to make a difference. And we've done a lot of R&D over a long time, as both us as a company, as an industry, as a society with academics, research institutes such as SINTEF and others, to study the permanence of CO2 storage and how we should appropriately measure, monitor, and verify the permanence. And I think we have good systems in place for that. So I think, we are well suited in that.
How long, I mean, is it permanent? Is storage permanent? Is there a leak risk?
There are monitoring activities in place actually on all these sites, and actually one of the reasons why you use reservoirs is that you have these monitoring systems.
So I think putting a definite year and saying 100% is obviously difficult, but we have monitoring solutions. We have experience that tells us that we can do this safely for a very long time. We have actually having oil and gas reservoirs around the world is a proof that those seals are tight and have stayed tight for millions of years. So there is ample evidence and proof that it will stay there for a very long time.
Good. Now, as we come to a close, I'll just point out that when you open a bottle of beer, you get CO2 coming out of it. And sparkling wine, the same, I believe. So why don't we go and try some opening up, proving carbon capture and utilization. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I believe there is beer and wine over there ready to be served. That ends all of the Blue Talks for this year. A big thank you to the 5 panelists here talking to me about carbon capture on board and the whole supply chain, and thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.